This is the first of a series of 11 drawings I did while working with an art teacher friend of mine in a halfway house in San Mateo, California in the late 70s. And I would do a drawing, one for the person who was sitting for me and one for myself. This first one is of Jenny. She spoke to no one. All they knew about Jenny was that she'd had a very, very hard life. She ambled her way around the hospital with great difficulties. You can see she has a bandage around her leg. But there was certainly an eloquence to her bearing and her demeanor, and I thought she was quite beautiful in her own way. This is John. John had the mental age of probably about a 7-year-old. He was very sweet, and I found it very touching that he used to call me Mommy. This is Abby. Abby had been in a terrible sports accident. I think she'd been skiing. She'd been a very beautiful young lady. She still was very beautiful, but she had had such devastation done to her when she'd fallen that her nervous system was completely, pretty much effectively destroyed. And she had a sort of a low, keening cry that kept coming out of her. It was quite sobering to look into her big blue eyes and think of how her life must have been for her before she had this accident. This is David. David's a paraplegic. He worked very hard to be involved in the little art class, and he would come in every day with a little device strapped around his head, which had a rubber nipple at the end, which held a pencil so that he could fill in a grid with a tree or a swing or a house or a ball of sunlight. I became very fond of everyone there, but particularly of David, because his will was indomitable and his quiet struggle was huge for him. This is a picture of a man who was having his last days on earth. He gave his consent to let me draw him as he lay dying. Those little yellow marks at the bottom of his figure were actually the little shoes that they had on him. The drawing that I did for him, well, there was no one to give it to. He didn't have family, and he passed away before we'd left the halfway house that afternoon. This is Walter. Walter was worn down. He didn't know where he was anymore, and he wandered the hallways and looking confused, not knowing where he was. But he was a very sweet man. This is the janitor who stopped in his job to let me sketch him quickly before he moved on. Unlike everyone else, of course, he was fit and young enough to still enjoy life. This is Mazzaro. I found Mazzaro's situation particularly haunting. He was Japanese. His parents had raised him all of his life on their back porch. He was never allowed playmates. He never went to school. His family were very ashamed of him, partly because his tongue would stick out at odd angles and his body was out of his control. This is David again, lying in bed with the sponge between his knees. This is a schizophrenic man. He had nothing debilitating about his physical condition. He was perfectly healthy, but he was at times rather dangerous, and I wasn't allowed to sit alone with him and draw him. I had to have somebody there with us in case things didn't go well. And this is David again. He's sitting up in his wheelchair with his drawing equipment ready to go. I thought the world of David. This is Wesley, my very dear friend. We went clubbing a lot. Those were some of my happiest, danciest days, and Wesley was marvelous company. He used to wear lots of bracelets and dress beautifully. He was a grande dame in the most wonderful sense. This is Prosper, a lovely man who was originally from Zimbabwe. I worked on an underground comic with him that he advised me on. This I call Sneering Girl. It's a red-headed friend of mine from our comics ladies consciousness-raising group, which didn't turn out well. So much for feminism. This is called Kirk and T. Kirk was a former boyfriend, T, militant, lesbian, feminist, and both very irksome to me at one point, and I drew them together and then scribbled on them. This is from a series called Luna. It's about the sex drives lying deep within a woman's nature or my own nature. It's always been very important for my art not retain a particular style just because I've found it, but to constantly morph and change as my influences morph and change. This is another page from Luna. The most interesting thing about it is that it's kind of psychological female imagery. And I do think it has its own power and wildness, which I like. This is the first page of the Luna strip. Bottom drawing is an anatomical rendition of the inner ear. The phrase I wrote in it was, Luna was born in great anger. So what she is the psyche of a modern woman who is trapped in a female mask, a lie, pummeled by voices like pistols. You know, she's hyper-aware of everything around her, and she's terrorized on a regular basis. She is victimized through her body, and she is held at bay from being completely herself. This is the second picture from that series. Again, very anatomical and yet kind of emotionally explosive. She's stuck within her own womb, sliding around, can't get out. She's lost in utterly familiar territory and cannot get out of the identity, the force field of being merely a woman. And that was very much my feeling during that period. When I first met Eduardo Paolozzi, when I came to England, he looked at that series and said, "Why aren't you famous?" Starting at the bottom of a figure, it's a self-portrait that I did still from that period, still from the late 70s, featuring my platform shoes and my feet, the chains being meant to represent the bondage I felt to the male species, to the problem of being female, and the kind of quality of being an unwilling geisha, which I felt I was caged by. This is the midriff of my self-portrait, more visual than anything else. For me, at that point, although I was writing my memoirs, I did not consider myself a writer. And so when I wasn't doing comics per se, these drawings were containing all the kind of cuneiforms and hieroglyphics of my femaleness and my psychological disarray and chaos. This is the top of that series, Fuck You, Buddy. It's got a lot of very tiny handwriting about bad feelings I had towards whatever partner I was with at the time. Fuck You, Buddy is done around the same time as Luna, again about the subject of feeling trapped. All the flowers and the obfuscating tendrils and things at the throat, which cover the throat chakra with beautiful femininity, the fur and feathers around the neck, the qualities of brassieres and lace. There's a little face with fur over it coming out from between the breasts. There's strange life inside there that's unacceptable and a little bit frightening. Undersea creatures, threatening-looking jellyfishes that are living on and inside the psychological body of the woman. Girlie, why are you hot to die? Okay, there was the object of my affection, a cartoonist who gave me no end of strife, but for 2 years of my life back in the late 70s, I was utterly obsessed with him. And the little picture at the top is of me, and the picture of the guy in shades is him. There's a cartoon character with a rifle at her breast, just where she's supposed to be softest. The 70s were a very strange time, like most times for women, because as there was a big move for personal freedom, well, I've got to say, for men, and women wanted freedom as well, but they didn't know how to express it and didn't know what freedoms they wanted because they'd never had it before. It's a bit like the employees of a monopoly suddenly finding they can set fire to a building, and instead of running free, they go back and they steal things and then get caught on the CCTV camera. So we got caught up and tripped over our own unexamined drives, confusion, and the danger we put ourselves into. The owl is actually a symbol of death in paintings from the Renaissance. The male character who's wearing sunglasses, he's got a bit of a bloody nose. In my mind, I'd punched him, but his eyes were hidden, his soul was hidden. I didn't know enemy from friend, and women were very alienated from each other, and they were cooperative in being used by men. It was a very strange melee to be involved with, where you couldn't depend on anyone or anything. While we were fighting for freedoms, we didn't know how to do it constructively, and we ended up as much victims as freedom fighters. Identiplate. This is my idea of an identikit image of the future. There were no such things as iris imprints. And I could see, or I could feel rather, that there was going to be more and more and more of that kind of personal invasion, where things would be known about us that were nobody else's business. I think that's why I put so many penises into it, and why I even put in that little streak at the bottom, which is meant to be scat or poo. The helpless face of the child who is like caught in a terrible photo flash, during which they can extract the patterns of the iris. This little painting has been quite prophetic, really, I think. This I call Chiquita Rock and Roll. It's an amalgam of Carmen Miranda and Little Richard. I really find the patterns pleasing in that. This is an image that I did from an anti-nuclear newspaper called It's About Times, and it featured Ronald Reagan on the cover of it quite often. This is one of those images. Here we have Screaming Paul. This is Paul Mavridis, another cartoonist from that period, whom I at some point also obsessed over, but I very much like this drawing, and it got a fair amount of attention. This, I really haven't got a title for it. I suppose it's some kind of symbolic rape image, carefully drawn with a lot of scratching around the crotch. I put this in, although it's a comic, because it's also portraiture. On the top left-hand panel is an image of William Burroughs and S. Clay Wilson, and Wilson is turning into sort of a cyclops in the second panel and grabbing Burroughs by the neck. Then in the third image, Charles Bukowski, a.k.a. Hank Bukowski, another wild and woolly writer from that period, has entered the bar, and Wilson is telling him what he thinks of him. He was a huge fan of Burroughs, was very afraid of homosexuality at the same time, so he was more comfortable with Bukowski because Bukowski was, at least in his writings, an out-of-control womanizer. This is just an experiment with drawing animals. There's all kinds of textures in those. You can see it better if you experience some of the close-up textures. Some of them are quite beautiful. This group of animals was sensuous to draw. I love drawing hair and fur. The expressions on creatures, I love their noses. The buffalo has a really lovely textural quality to his coat, and I was very much in love with steel engravings and fine black and white drawings. I didn't have a repeatograph. They didn't come along till later, technical pens. So I used a dip pen for these, so that meant that every time you made a stroke, you had to dip the pen in the inkwell again. But it was wonderful. It was like petting the animal to draw them. The elephant seal and the red panda, probably some of these animals are extinct by now, but the elephant seal had such a beautiful satiny texture. It was like stroking his body with my pen, and even though it's made up of a lot of very tiny scratch marks, it still has that lovely, sleek, wet quality. I especially love his flippers. There's a little monkey at the top of the picture, which I love. The only made-up creature is the bat-winged demon character. He's sniffing poppies, and he was lots of fun as well, all his little scales and his little beard and all the kind of algae-like stuff on the top of his head. And this is a still life, again, with textures that I like very, very much. Self-portrait with tripes. This is a drawing I did after I came to the UK. I got involved with what was happening to the miners during that period. The more I looked into what was going on in England, the more utterly detestable Margaret Thatcher seemed to me, so I've drawn her as Kronos devouring her own children. The ideal husband. When I was a girl, I read Jane Eyre and was completely besotted with Mr. Rochester. I also loved the Beast from Beauty and the Beast, so this is kind of a sweet, wild and woolly portrait of my ideal man, complete with third eye. That eye stayed with me as an image. I played with the pen and ink and used a lot of mixed materials. I used watercolors, acrylics, black ink. You can see a lot of the detail in his hair, his mouth, and his nose, and all the color around his face. You feel utterly what it's made from. I always like to leave things a little bit unfinished and not finish the whole piece so you can see the suit he's wearing. Well, I haven't really bothered to do anything much but make a superficial wash around it because I want the total focus to be on his eyes and his mouth and his beard and his hair. I think it's a wonderful personal tulpa, a created entity which I'm still hypnotized by. Mermaid in a tub. I'd entered it into a contest, and of course it didn't even get an honorable mention. I think because the painting was so big, people were very alarmed at her face and at her big blue breasts. She was a kind of a premonition of the Lost Girls style. She's done completely in color crayons. Now, there may be some colored pencils in there mixed in together, yeah. I love the surprised, sexy, and alienated look on her face. I love the whole idea of a mermaid in a bathtub, and I really love using Fauvist colors. You know, color has always hypnotized me. This is the Lobster Woman of Toledo. You won't see any reason why I've done this, but I was stimulated by the classic painting Eleanor of Toledo, done by a very sedate portraitist, Il Bronzino. This looks nothing like that painting anyway, so there's no point in even referencing it except to show the kind of mad things that artists think about. The furry yet luminous textures in this image. The sensuous lips of the lobster mandrill creature and the surprised doll eye coming over the horizon. The weird satin on her sleeves was lots of fun, and the beadwork and the odd flowers and the pinched waist of her dress. Probably the only detail that's like Eleanor of Toledo, where the lovely delicate hands of Eleanor of Toledo is playing a tassel of pearls over her hand. And I was quite hurt when I took the picture in to be framed, and the man looked at it and said, "What the hell is this? Is this some kind of Salvador Dali crap?" Well, this is high-kicking Dolly, just another one of my doll portraits with a kind of a splash of color, a bit of mixed media. And this is the first color drawing done of Betty Page that I know of, because that was done in 1980, and that was turned into a calling card. This is a preliminary drawing for a painting called Pink Boy. The actual painting that I did is quite large. This is an A2-sized piece of paper. At that point, I was doing preliminary drawings for all my big paintings, which I do not do now. The girl standing is a sort of take on Blue Boy, but with a female body, which I found very interesting and enjoyable. There's the Virgin of Guadalupe behind her, glittering and glowing. The startling effect of Blue Boy having enormous breasts, I think it was quite a satisfying juxtaposition of images and also worked quite well. You can't help but miss the erotically charged body of Lurch and a very nicely drawn bottle in the background, which I was pleased with. Again, it was done with mixed medium. It was done with Dr. Martin's luminous inks, as well as pencil, color crayon, and acrylic paint. And this is Naked Self-Portrait with a ray gun. There are some very nice textures in here when you look close up in some of the features in the face. And this is Spanking Betty, which was actually done in the UK when I was working with Skin 2 magazine, and I happened to be partners with a fella that couldn't get enough Betty Page drawings. And this is Self as Jungle, I suppose. Nice, satisfying textures going on when you examine it a little more closely. I like the idea of stark spaces near very full spaces. The adventurousness that I believe I showed in some of the colored turmoil in the backdrop, as opposed to the very precise bits in the front, images from undersea creatures, and little margay in the middle of my forehead, the butterfly wings. I think of art as a kind of music. I've always thought of art as a kind of music, and indeed I've always listened to music. When I do my art, it helps me fill in the spaces, make the work vibrate, and have an all-over rhythm which encompasses all of the different things that I'm attempting in one image. There's some cartoon imagery to the side of my mouth. I love the undersea creatures. I thought about filling in some of the white bits and thought, no, I like their starkness because, again, they draw the eye back to the busier pieces, and I also feel it's very important for the eye to have an adventure when it enters my pictures, so that you have wild territory and you have peaceful areas, and then you have wild territory again.